This is Daniel. I run the Rambo page, and Tech fans, you're in for a treat. As if you were to ask me what living Georgia Tech sports figure, and I say living because Dodd is gone. John Heisman spent as many years in heaven as he has on earth, and we lost Homer Rice a couple years ago. If you were to ask me what living Georgia Tech figure I were to interview, if you could pick any, I probably would say you. This is Bill Curry. If you're old enough, his reputation precedes himself. But if you're my age and don't know as much as I do, because I'm a sports nerd here, I'll explain. He played for Bobby Dodd from 62 to 64, am I correct on that?
Well, actually, if you count freshmen in that, I got there in 60. So 60 through 64.
Okay, and then he played in the NFL for the great Vince Lombardi, and then for the great Don Shula. That's where your longest stints were. I know you were with the Oilers and I think the Rams in
That's
Venezuela.
right. Yep.
And then spent some time as an assistant. You were on Pepper Rogers' staff for
That's
a
right.
year.
That's right.
And then in 1980, got called back to his alma mater. Coached Tech for 7 years. What I would say was an up and down 7 years, if that's the best way to describe it. And then left for Alabama, was at Alabama, coached Kentucky, and then founded Georgia State's program. And he looks pretty sharp for 82. I don't know if the audience watching.
That's deceiving.
That's deceiving. Well, age happens, but you still look pretty good for how old you are. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. My wife and I are enjoying the fact that we've been married 62 years and that we're both still kicking. She's especially productive right now. She writes books. And we can get into that if you wish, but we don't have to, because she comes over here too, and she gets on the air, and we're going to have a special time with her. But among my great blessings, one of the very best, right after my family, is my former players. And two of them are here today, and one of my former coaches is here. And that just blows my mind, that they would go to the trouble to show up for us to have a conversation about our lives together. Sometimes it's very pleasant and we can choose what we want to remember. And sometimes we remember the hard things that are not pleasant at all. We try to be balanced, and the guy that handles all that is Pete Welburn, who is unparalleled as a former player. Unparalleled anywhere, anybody. I dare them to try to match Pete Welburn as a great former player for somebody like me or somebody that's been in our profession.
Well, when I did this, I went to your website because I was thinking okay, maybe I could get a guest or something, and you passed my mind for some reason, because I on YouTube occasionally you would pop up and you're on some fellow small creator show and stuff like that. And so I go to your website and it says email Bill, and then his wife, who's your secretary, responds and says, Bill would love to be in your podcast. And I said something I won't say on here. I said, you're bleeping me. Ain't no way. And so I sort of threw a Hail Mary at the wall, and it was caught here. So you grew up in College Park outside of Atlanta. I am aware that your dad was a Bulldog. Is that correct?
He was born in Athens. He grew up in Athens. He was a very sickly teenager who was an only child in a very tough home situation. Was not allowed to go out for tough sports, but sneaked out for football his senior year at Athens High. He was a defensive end at 5'11", 142 pounds. And in the process, he went to the YMCA in downtown Athens, and a coach named L.H. Cunningham showed him an Olympic set. 4 years later, he was the national light heavyweight lifting champion of the United States of America. He won it in Madison Square Garden at a body weight of 191.
Oh my
And
goodness.
he had nobody to train him. He was just a driven soul. So I grew up at Woodward with that driven soul, who was the weightlifting, boxing, and gymnastics coach for what was then called Georgia Military Academy. But if he's still in evidence there, because unless they've taken it down, we could go to the weight room today, and there's a plaque there that says the Major Bill Curry weight room.
And
So I was influenced, had a heavy influence to be competitive.
Yes. So your dad was a Bulldog, and from what I've heard, great athlete. So you grew up sort of around athletics, but you grew up in Atlanta. What were your impressions of Tech athletics growing up? Were you a Georgia Tech fan, or were you just like, were you
No,
more?
I wasn't. I didn't even watch football. I didn't want to play football. I didn't like football. It was too hard. You had to run into people. I was going to pitch for the New York Yankees, and only one thing kept me out of the majors: talent.
It's
So
like that.
when I found out, when it occurred to me that maybe I wasn't going to be quite good enough to pitch in the majors, I started pouring it on in the sport of football, and that took me a long time. Seriously, when I first went out, I was not interested in contact, and of course the coaches noticed that. So I was encouraged to learn that gift of being able to run into another person. And now that I'm 82 years old, I kind of wish I had never done that. That's a joke.
No, I know. Well, I am aware, you've done interviews, and every time someone asks you, why did you choose Tech, it's the story of you wanted to be close to your childhood sweetheart, who is still your wife.
That's a fact.
Yes, and that's amazing dedication, and the fact that you've been married this long, that's just a great story. Again, I told you off camera, you're like the Forrest Gump of college football. She's your Jenny, you could say.
She is.
But when did you first meet Bobby Dodd? Your first ever, if you can remember, what was your first meeting with him?
Oh, I remember. My high school counselor had called me in and said, "Don't dare consider Georgia Tech. You have no chance of surviving there academically." She said, "Bill, you're not a stupid boy, but you have frolicked all the way through high school. Georgia Tech has national merit scholars. They study calculus and physics and chemistry. You would not survive 2 semesters." So I thanked her and went down to the library and looked up the word frolic. She was right. What she didn't know is that I'd gotten a hold of a map, and I discovered that Georgia Tech was the closest campus to Agnes Scott College. And my number one driving ambition in life, even before the New York Yankee thing, was to marry Carolyn Newton. And I had announced it in the 6th grade. We've got the record. Her mother kept the note that I wrote
Oh
to
my
her.
gosh.
It's dated December 24th, 1954. We were 12 years old. I told her I would love her all my life, and I have. She was not a bit interested in me. So I had to stay close to her, and that's what I did. And so I went to Georgia Tech, a place where really I had no business academically.
And so then what kind of coach was Coach Dodd? I've heard that he cared. I heard that, he cared for his players. He wouldn't yell, he wouldn't curse. But say you're playing, because you were, I believe it was the last years of the SEC, and then you transitioned in 1964 to independent,
Yeah.
which a lot of people say was a mistake, but not a lot of people consider the 140 rule or whatever that was. We won't get into that, but say you're playing Tennessee, playing Alabama, playing Georgia, big game. What would Coach Dodd say in the locker room before you would go out?
Well, I'll give you the locker room bit, but let me just give you a synopsis of why there had to be a change. The schools we were competing against all around us were signing 60 players every year and running 30 of them off. He wouldn't do that. His meeting with us at the beginning of each year was this: "Now men, My record at Tennessee as a quarterback is 27-1. And I'm a second quarter sophomore, and I'm 53 years old, or 54, or however old he was that year. Then he would say, that is not going to happen to you, because you're going to go to every class. You're going to sit on the front row. You're going to learn how to take notes. You're going to graduate from one of the great schools in America and be able to compete in the business world, or I will send you home. Does everybody understand? And that's the only reason I graduated from Georgia Tech, is because my football coach loved me too much to allow me to self-destruct when I could not see my own potential. And here's how he did it. I was 17 years old. Honestly, I had not even turned 18. And he had told us to go to every class. But I had chemistry at 8 o'clock in the morning. For God's sakes, I was tired. We had all these practices, and I had to study and go to tutoring.
For the record, chemistry, if you were to ask me what my least favorite, because I'm just wrapping up high school, what my least favorite class at high school was, chemistry kicked me in the rear end.
Yeah,
So if a 17-year-old Bill Curry was to tell me I don't want to go to chemistry at 8 a.m., yeah, me neither.
Yeah.
Chemistry at 8 a.m. doesn't sound fun.
I had no idea what the guy was saying, and I thought my time would be better spent sleeping. Well, in fact, no way they could catch me. There were 100 kids in the class, right? The next day, my name appeared on the bulletin board. Bill Curry, report to Grant Field, 5:30 a.m. Wednesday morning in your running gear. The assistant coach, Dick Inman, who later became friends with me, ran me up and down the west stands till I could not stand up. Whereupon I decided that chemistry at 8 o'clock in the morning was a wonderful thing.
Yep.
And I never cut another class.
And those West stands, it's had Grant Field, I'd say Hyundai Field, it's had a lot of change. Those West stands are still there. They're steep.
They're steep and they're irregular and they're hard. Yeah, they're not fun.
Great place to watch a game, but I can imagine going up and down them over and over. Not fun.
Not good.
And then you said you would get to the locker room.
By the way, I never cut another class. Never. And that's the only reason I graduated.
That's amazing. And it probably, Tech's challenging. I mean, I don't know how, I've heard about it. I don't know how my dad got through 4 years of it. Although he was an architecture major, which is funny because he never even pursued architecture. He's now a real estate banker, which does show the value of a tech degree, that you can change careers.
Yeah. Those architects are the hardest working guys on the campus. And when I was the head coach, I would get over there at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and the lights would be on in the architecture building, and I'd leave at midnight, and the lights would be on in the architecture building.
So what I said earlier, and you said you would get to this, what would Coach Dodd say before a big game?
The man, he refused to say Georgia. He had no trouble with Georgia Tech, but he could not say Georgia. Georgie are a fine football team. It just killed the Bulldog. They hated that. Georgie will come running out on the field, and you'll see they're bigger than we are. They're faster than we are. They're a little tougher than we are. And they're going to be so fired up, they're going to be slapping each other upside the head. They're going to be screaming, jumping up and down. A couple of them are going to throw up on the sideline just for good measure. We're not going to do any of that. We're going to direct our energy. We're going to be careful how we grow, how we warm up. We're going to conserve our energy. And then we're going to start the game. And it's going to be hard. They're going to be tough. They're good. They're going to knock the stuffings out of us. And they might get ahead, but they won't get very far ahead if you play the way I've taught you. What did I teach you? No turnovers, no mistakes, play field position, punt the ball, make them drive the length of the field. That changes the game. And then, yes, they might be ahead, but they won't be very far ahead. And then somewhere around late in the third quarter, they're gonna get tired because they wasted all that energy warming up, and we didn't. We're not gonna be tired. And when that happens, they're gonna make a mistake. And when that happens, when they make a mistake, I'm gonna think of something, and we're gonna beat them.
And he's known, his book is called Dodd's Luck, and so what might have been luck to other coaches was just more being prepared for the situation at hand.
He really believed, and I left out an important part of his speech. He really believed he was luckier than other people. Bear Bryant wrote in his book that he would rather look across the field on Saturday afternoon and see anybody other than Dodd, because he could beat you with his brain. And that's exactly what Coach Dodd did. Because what I left out of my little pregame speech there, and he usually said this, he'd say, we only have one advantage here. See, we are smarter than they are. And we were stupid enough to believe that. And so, but we did believe it. We believed it.
And if you believe it enough, it
That's right.
comes to fruition. Were you, I don't know how much playing time you got, because you may have not started, but were you there in 1962 when y'all beat Bama when they were ranked number one?
I was right there on the sideline with a clean jersey at the end of the game. And it was embarrassing. I was told by an assistant coach that I would never play because I was so embarrassed. That's the year Carolyn and I got married, 1962. And yes, we had that great win over Alabama, and yes, I celebrated with my teammates, but I didn't get to play. And so I made up my mind that I was going to do something to find a way to play, and I went to one of the coaches. He said, no, Bill, you'll never, your feet are, you just don't move your feet well enough, and I'm sorry. So I was crushed. I walked out of the locker room just broken hearted. And it was only a day or two, another assistant coach named John Robert Bell came to my locker, put his big old paw on my shoulder, and he said, Bill, I know you can play. Why don't you and I work on your footwork? Let's do it this spring, and let's do it all summer. That's what we did. I played 12 more years.
And Coach Dodd was known for having just great assistant staffs, and of course there are names like Frank Royals and Ray Graves that get the spotlight, but John Robert Bell and all the lesser names, they make the same impact on people's lives that the big names do.
Well, you take John Robert Bell and apply him to a head coaching job, which he got at East Tennessee State, and they won the national championship in their division, sacking Terry Bradshaw 10 times.
Oh my goodness. That must have been one of the hardest days Terry had in his football
Terry
career.
did not have a good
Yeah.
year.
So, I would be remiss if I didn't ask, this is tech themed podcast, but I would be extremely remiss if I didn't ask a couple questions about your NFL career. I assume when you got picked by Green Bay, and it's funny because the draft is tonight, it starts tonight, and it's in Green Bay. But I assume you get picked by Green Bay last round. Back then they had way more rounds than they do now.
They had 20 rounds.
They had 20 rounds, which I think, what do they have now? 7, which is nearly a third of that.
Yeah.
But you go, and you've told the story many times that it was the first time you were in a huddle with African Americans. Now I know Coach Dodd wanted to integrate tech, and he eventually did when he was AD, when they got Eddie McShann and those guys in, when Bud Carson was there. But it was the first time you were in a huddle with an African American. And then the weather, I assume, was also painful, because here you are, a boy from Georgia, going up to Wisconsin, the frozen tundra. That must have been a culture shock, really.
It was ridiculous. I remember being on it wasn't the practice field, it was actually Lambeau Field. Because Lombardi had this system of pipes underneath Lambeau. It was supposed to thaw the surface. It didn't work. And it was so cold. And it's the only time in my life, the only time, that I actually had the thought. I weighed the feeling in my body, and the thought occurred to me, I am going to die today, here on this field, because my body's not going to manage this. And at that moment, my adversary at practice, my major adversary was Ray Nitschke, one of the great middle linebackers of all time. And Nitschke happened to be nearby, so I just said, "How long are we going to be out here?" He said, "Till he gets cold." So I look over, I had never seen a snowmobile suit in my life, but Vince Lombardi had one, and he had it on, and the rest of us did not.
Oh man. Well, getting, you said earlier you at first didn't like getting hit, but I assume when it's that cold and that bitter, all that body contact, that doesn't sound that bad when it's that cold, does it?
We weren't worried about body contact. By the time you're in the league for a little while, you stop worrying. If you're worried about body contact, they'll send you home.
Yeah, that is
Real
true.
quick.
But it's more like like getting busted upside the head.
Yeah.
More like hard hits. That when it's that cold, it might be less painful than the bitterness. And I might be wrong, but it sounds that
Either
way.
way, it's not fun.
And then you played in 4 Super Bowls. The term Super Bowl wasn't added until retroactively. The first one was billed the AFL NFL World Championship. Did you realize how big of a deal that was? And obviously it wasn't as big, they had jetpacks, which I assume in the 60s must have been the coolest thing in the world. But there was no halftime show, there wasn't no singing, and there were way less commercials. But did you realize how big of a deal that game was?
No, we just knew we wanted to finish the job. And I had to leave the game with an injury. It's the only game that year. I started every game of the year and finished every game of the year. But that one, I got injured. I think it was the second quarter, with an ankle. And I watched as our defense turned up the volume, turned up the speed, and turned up the blitzing in the second half. And as great as Lenny Dawson was,
Couldn't avoid him.
the Kansas City Chiefs, even he couldn't handle what he was getting from David Robinson and Leroy Caffey and Ray Nitschke and Willie Davis. And Henry Jordan. There were a bunch of Hall of Famers, and it was awesome to watch that. And unfortunately, I had to stand there and watch it. That was painful.
You did eventually get to play, but you first, the expansion happens. First in Atlanta, which I assume, you weren't playing there, but that had to have been exciting for you. You're like, my hometown's getting a football team.
It was.
You're going to be able to go.
Very nice.
You're like, I'm going to be able to go. You're like, I'm going to be able to go home and play in front of my hometown.
Yeah.
And then 1 year later, New Orleans gets it, and you're unprotected. Now, when you first hear about New Orleans, gold helmet, but otherwise nothing really could be exciting about that because it's a new team, and while it's a familiar climate temperature-wise, there's going to be a lot of losing. But then you get traded to Baltimore. What was that like?
First of all, when I got the call that I'd been put on the expansion list, I sat down on the floor and sobbed like a baby. And Carolyn didn't know what to do with me. It broke my heart. But it was Lombardi had no choice with the system that he had, that the league had. You'd put 3 players up to be claimed, and the Saints, the expansion team could take 1, then you could withdraw 2. And Coach Lombardi explained that he had 2 centers, the other was Ken Bowman. And he said, well, you got 2 centers, you got to put the centers on the list and then take back the one that isn't claimed. But I still blamed him, and to this day I regret that because I said some inflammatory things as a result that I shouldn't have said. But it was a very difficult time, and then the phone rang, and there was this voice claiming to be Don Shula, and I thought, well, this is one of my buddies messing with me. And I almost said a smart aleck remark, but I restrained myself. And it was Don Shula, and he was calling to say, if I trade for you, would you be okay? Would you be happy coming to Baltimore, even if you just played special teams? Because Coach Dodd had taught us special teams so well that we could all play every special team, and Shula had noticed because he loved special teams.
There's a famous video online that I saw that's a long kicking instructional of Dodd teaching it, and he's voicing it over. And for a middle-aged man, he must have been 40 or 50, he's kicking the ball like far, like he was an expert at it.
Outkicked our punter every time they had a contest. And that was Billy Lothridge for a while.
Yeah.
Who was runner-up for the Heisman. So yeah, Coach Dodd what he did was he gave me a path to continue my career, because Don Shula was serious. And when he said, would you be happy coming to Baltimore just to play special teams? My answer was, Coach, I would walk to Baltimore to play for you. Yes, I'll play every special team.
So that's, and that's where you had I believe the longest stint of your career was in Baltimore. You eventually got that second Super Bowl ring, and fast forward, I know most interviews they talk about your NFL career, but I'm just fascinated by the time you had at Tech later. So you were with Pepper Rogers' staff in 1976. Now, Pepper Rogers, if you had, and so I'm not asking you this is rhetorical, but if you were to envision a person who would represent the decade of the 1970s, then it is Pepper Rogers with the disco curl and his shirts and his flamboyance.
Yeah.
And
his
so
purse.
Yeah, and you're with him for a year, then you go back to Green Bay. And then what was the process of Tech hiring you like? Now I did read Kim King's book, and he said in his book that was released in like 2003, sometime before he died of cancer far too soon, but he said that he was on the search committee, but it was sort of in limbo. Doug Lever was about to leave to go to Michigan State, which was his alma mater, and Homer Rice wasn't brought in until after you had arrived.
Correct.
So what was really getting hired by Tech like? And I've heard that they had other names. I think Bobby Collins at Southern Miss, they had asked for the job, which thank goodness they didn't, because he later got SMU in trouble. But I believe Jim Carlin, I think they asked him, he was at South Carolina, I might be wrong about that. But what was the process of getting interviewed and getting the Tech job like?
It was like Shangri-La. It's like magic. We're gonna fly you in New Orleans, and you sit down with a committee. Dr. Pettit's there, Kim's there, others. And Doug Weaver had not announced his impending departure. If he knew about it at that time, he wasn't saying anything. And he was the main recruiter, because he came to Green Bay and we went to dinner and we spent a lot of time together. That was magic. Doug Weaver was a very compelling personality and a terrific athletic director. And so it was incredible. And I didn't have the slightest idea that I would get the job. And then when they called, to this day, I can't articulate what I felt. It was so wonderful.
Well, I mean, it's your alma mater not only getting your first head coaching job. Most people have to work their way up, and of course Tech wasn't in a conference, but Tech was still, yes, Pepper Rogers had a 4-6-1 season, I believe, but Tech had gone 4-6 with Bud Carson, and they had an up and down 70s, but they were not terrible in the 70s, and so that still must have been a respectable job, and it was your alma mater. That must have felt great. So you arrive at Tech, and while 2 years prior, yes, they had Eddie Lee Ivory, and he was running all over Air Force, and they made the Peach Bowl. You arrive at Tech, and while there are some weapons on the roster, I mean, did you realize how bad? I mean, you have the old South Horseshoe, and it's 70 years old, and it hasn't been renovated, and you have the Naval Armory, which is where the Edge Center and we'll get to Homer Rice later, but did you realize what you were getting into? Did you realize how turbulent the situation was?
No, I as time passed, and as I looked around, the first thing that dawned on me was that I had no idea what I was doing. The worst possible preparation to become a college head football coach is to play in the NFL for a long time. I learned one thing in the NFL. Despite Coach Shula allowing me to play special teams for him, I learned how to survive as an offensive center. It took every fiber of my being. I didn't learn staff construction. I didn't learn recruiting. I didn't learn fundraising. I didn't learn construction of falling down locker rooms and stadiums. I didn't learn any of the things that I was going to be needing in order to be a head coach. And here I was. So that began to dawn on me quickly.
So y'all were able to learn, well, I say y'all, mean you as well as Tech, and Bobby Dodd had a bit of influence. You were able to get Homer Rice, and so he comes, and I've read that apparently he sees your first spring practice, and he says, "I told my wife to not unpack yet."
I called Phyllis and said, "Don't unpack. I just saw the team."
But there were weapons there. It was a rough roster, but Ken Wisenhunt was there.
Here's what you have to remember about Georgia Tech. It wasn't just a matter of who's there so we can win a game or 2 or 10. It's a matter of academic integrity. What's the graduation rate? What are the training rules? Do you have a curfew? Do you enforce the curfew? Do you make the guys behave the way student athletes should behave at the Georgia Institute of Technology? Now that had been ground into all of us because of Coach Dodd's. That was Coach Dodd's greatest gift. For those of us that survived and went through his program, we found out you don't mess around. And if you'll do that at Georgia Tech, you will not only survive, you'll thrive.
Yes.
But if you don't do that, you will not make it. And it's not like that at a lot of other schools.
Was it not there when you arrived, or was it there?
Well,
in the players?
I'm not going to comment on that.
All right. So 1980, rough year. However, another reason I give you so much credit was you were able to will your team to some of the weirdest moments in Tech history.
Yeah.
First, 1980. Now, I know a tie is not a win, and overtime, had it existed, we don't know if Tech would have won or not. But you go into the game with a win over Memphis State, and you're entering a game with Notre Dame. Now, Notre Dame in the 80s, they eventually reached the cusp with Lou Holtz. But this is Dan Devine, who is the exact opposite of you at the time. He's a coaching veteran. You're in your first year. They're ranked number 1. And you have, I think Ken Wisenhunt was playing quarterback.
Well, we ran out of quarterbacks.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
completely out. I mean, nobody that had ever taken a snap in a college game was on our sideline. Wisenhunt had played quarterback a little bit in high school. So I called Ken over, and he and I have laughed about this conversation a lot of times. I said, "Ken, we have the ball on our 4-yard line." And I didn't say to him, the number 1 defense in America is lined up against you out there. But that Notre Dame defense, I'm pretty sure was ranked number 1 at the moment. I said to Ken, "Can you get the snap and just run straight ahead?" And his response was, "Coach, don't worry about a thing. I can handle it fine." He took off. And the next thing we knew, a few years later, he was coaching the Super Bowl. The guy's smart and he's good. He ended up being a great tight end, by the way.
Yes. That's what I was saying. And I knew I ran out of quarterbacks because what was there? I think you had Mike Kelly, who was from the previous regime. And then, was Jim Bob Taylor there, or did you recruit him?
No, he wasn't there.
You were, I think it
He
was.
came in 82.
So then, rough year, and even rougher was the fact that the tie actually helped the other school in the state because Notre Dame was one.
We helped the Bulldogs to win the national
Yes,
championship.
which you never want to do, but
That
it
was not our goal.
Yeah, but and then on that day, it's probably the most memorable. Well, one of the most memorable days in the state because down in Jacksonville, Run Lindsay Run happened.
Yeah,
But
sure did.
then in 1981, you opened the season, and you had opened with them the year before, Alabama, and their, Bear Bryant's reputation as a winner precedes itself. And I have heard, and I don't know about time telling me this, but I've heard that you helped mend the relationship, and that's how the series was able to restart back in the late 70s.
That's true.
So that's true.
That's a true story.
And so you're facing them.
Excuse me, but I helped mend the relationship between him and Coach
Dodd.
Dodd.
Yes.
At his request, Coach Bryant asked me to do it, so he gets the credit for that.
That's good.
And he should.
So you're facing them, and it's hot. It's in Birmingham, Legion Field, because that's where they play most of their bigger games, and it was a season opener, I think. And Bama jumps out to a 10-0 lead, and I think they were up 13-7 at halftime.
I don't know.
But Robert Levette plays I won't say the game of his life, considering he's Tech's all-time leading rusher. But for a freshman, for his life at that point, he plays the game of his life. What was it like, that comeback to beat Bama? I mean, and one that nobody expected. I think the line was like Bama was favored by 24 points.
It totally unglued us, which was all my fault. The next year, when Coach Bryant brought Alabama over to our stadium, by the way, he and I had formed a wonderful friendship through a game called the Coaches All-American game, where he was my line coach for a week up in Buffalo, New York. I thought he would be angry. I thought he would not like me because I was a Tech guy, and it was just the opposite. He was so wonderful. We really we bonded. And so before this game, the next year, he said, I thought your winning that game was going to help you, but it actually hurt you, didn't it? I said, it hurt us because I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how to bring our guys back to earth, and we never got our feet back on the ground that year.
Yes, and it included a loss to Navy. And what's funny is Navy, when you think about losing to Navy, that doesn't sound good, but it introduced Tech into one of their greatest foes, a man named George Welsh. And
Eddie Myers, the running back, good gosh, we couldn't tackle him. He's ended up being a bank president or something.
oh my goodness. Well, everyone talks about 84 being a turning point, which it was, but 1982 for Tech and for your program was a surprising year. There was no flashy win or tie, nothing like the Notre Dame or Alabama game the two previous years. You did beat Johnny Majors in Tennessee, and Jack Westbrook had a very big punt return.
Yeah, he did.
And how did you manage to, after 2 one-win seasons, break above 500?
I don't know. We learned little by little, and we recruited hard. We got some good players joined us. Jim Bob Taylor just showed up his father delivered him to us because Homer Rice had recruited him when Homer was at Rice University, and Jim Bob was a Texas boy. He helped us a lot, and there were a lot of things, but that was ages ago.
And so then, fast forward, 1984, I would say, is probably, it didn't exist yet, but but you could tell the core of the defense was forming. Pat Swilling was there. I think by 84, Ted Roof had arrived, and they didn't make a bowl just because bowl games, there were less of them. I think had the now bowl games existed now, 82 probably makes a bowl, 84 probably makes a bowl.
Yeah.
But 84, you beat Clemson, you beat Bama, and then end of the year, you go into Athens. And first, before I get into that game, what was Vince Dooley like? Because that was he was there for a long time, arguably the best coach George has ever had. Although Kirby might reach that if he continues at the rate that he has. But what was Vince Dooley like, and what was coaching against him like?
Well, what was coaching against him like? It was a dominating running game. He was going to have that no matter what. He found great running backs and big, agile offensive linemen, and you were going to have to stop their run one way or the other. And this happened whether or not they had Herschel Walker.
Yes.
Throw Herschel Walker in the mix, and you got national championship.
Yes.
That's what Vince Dooley was like. He had teams. His teams were a lot like Dodd teams in that they just didn't make mistakes, and they were very creative in the ways they attacked you.
And then, so then it must have been, well, to the fans it must have been a surprise that in '84 you go into Athens, and at this point you had John Dewberry, who was quite a character in himself.
You could say that.
And could throw the ball. I think the '70s were a wishbone dominated decade, and then you have the '80s that start first starting with the NFL. Bill Walsh and throwing the ball, and then John Dewberry is slinging the ball down the field and using his legs, and y'all go into Athens and not only win, you could argue dominated the entire game against Georgia in '84.
But we didn't win throwing the ball. We found something in their defense, and it was the only time that I could remember a Vince Dooley team where the defense, and especially with Irk Russell being the defensive coordinator, another great football coach, we found a couple of things that we could exploit, and it worked. And sometimes that happens.
Dooley ran. I remember because YouTube. There's a clip. There's a running touchdown he had, and there's a hole. It's sort of like later with George Agazzi. He just runs right through it, and that was, I think, the first time that the team ripped up the hedges after a win. Which
they weren't supposed to. They had strict orders to leave the hedges alone, and there are all kinds of stories about who started it and who was belligerent when others tried to stop them. And the guys, it's been a lot of years, so most of it's BS.
Well, I wasn't suggesting you. I wasn't suggesting you started. Most people think John Dewberry did because he was the one on the cover, on the front page of the newspaper.
He blames. He says, because I took that picture and showed it to him, and I said, "Explain, please." He said, "Coach, I did not go. I went over and told those guys to quit pulling up the hedges, and one of them stuck this in my hand." That was his answer.
Well, so you had a good '84, and then the Black Crotch really got going in '85. Now, you brought in Don Lindsay in '84. How did you bring him into the picture? Did you know him previously?
No. He was going to get out of coaching, and he just reminded me of that the other day. I had completely forgotten. But when Homer saw his credentials, Homer Rice made so many contributions to help us win that I wouldn't know where to begin or end. But this probably is the biggest one because Lindsay is such a genius. But he studied Lindsay's background, and he studied Lindsay's contract demands, which were substantial. And he called me in and he said, "Call him up and tell him, okay, we'll do it." And that's how we got him. I got him because Homer made it so, and it was a big plus for us.
And then so in '84 was his first year there, and then '85 he starts the Black Watch with the stripe and helmet decal line, and that was a group on the defense. I think Ted Roof was the first. Was he the inaugural?
Well, Don came to me and he said, "We have a special player, He's unique. I'm not sure I've seen anybody like him. Roof. And because we have Roof, I think we could have a special unit, and it might work. It's a risk because it can create all kind of dissension for the players who don't get on it, or the other side of the ball, or what have you. But I think because of Roof's presence, and because we would only allow Roof to select who's going to be on the unit, I think it would work. And then I learned about the Black Watch in Scotland and how they were the baddest warriors in the world, and that's where we got the name.
And you already had black jerseys because the NCAA, I think it was either conferences or NCAA.
NCAA.
They had them switched
and I love
to dark.
black jerseys.
Well, it's funny. Just because of the generation I'm in, I've always seen. I'm more used to Tech with navy, but I've heard that black was Dodd. Like when they wore white because it was hot, and then when it would get cold, they switched. Like they would have like a.
But our home uniform was white and gold.
Yes.
White jerseys, gold breeches, but we weren't allowed to do. The NCAA ruled against that. That's the only reason we went to dark jerseys, and we had a very strong contingent. I'm one of them who detests blue jerseys.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why.
Well, I think Ross brought it back, and I think that they did wear blue. I think it was footage of Clint Castleberry in blue.
Well, I wasn't around for that.
Yeah. I like graphic design and I like sports, and so uniforms are where those two meet. So we don't have time for uniform conversation because you can get me going on that. But I do know that Dodd started gold helmets, gold pants, white jersey. It has stuck since. It is the Georgia Tech look, and it's unique because only Tech and LSU do it.
Yeah.
And so then 1985, great year, narrow loss to Auburn, which I know Bo Jackson you can't stop that. Just one of a kind
Well,
athlete.
Ted Roof had a helmet. His helmet was broken. He came out of that game for one play, and they handed the ball to Bo on a sprint draw. And we had a freshman middle linebacker in the game. They did not block him, but he couldn't make the tackle, and Bo just.
Yeah, and just
If Roof had been in the game, we would probably won.
well, I mean, it was a great game. It's on YouTube, and I've seen this great game because you have Tech. That was by far, the best team of your time at Tech, and then you have Auburn with Bo Jackson. Great game. But you still started the year strong. Little hiccup against Auburn, tie with Tennessee, which was a great team. Johnny Majors was a great coach.
No excuse for that, though, and no excuse for losing to Virginia. But those were my fault.
But end of the year, foggy night, and Georgia's coming to town, and they're fired up because of what had happened the year prior, and it looks like they have momentum. And then the kickoff happens, and Gary Lee returns it. And that's probably the most memorable single play. If you were to ask Tech fans from that time period, what play from the Bill Curry period would you think of? They probably would say Gary Lee's kick return. What do you remember from that play?
I'd say the biggest play of my career is when we signed Ted Roof to a grant and aid. Seriously. But yeah, Gary Lee did a great job because we had a beautiful blocking scheme with a big wave of players leading him to the left, and he totally ignored it and went the other way and outran everybody on the Georgia team.
One of the funniest moments from that kick return is the kicker's in front of him, and the kicker, it's artificial turf, but the kicker just falls on his back. And
that's the best thing to do, trying to tackle Gary in the open field.
Yeah. And then the All-American Bowl, and one of the reasons a lot of people respect you is because of what happened with that game. You have Michigan State. They're a team who started the year slow, and then they just were on fire late in the year in Big Ten play. George Perles was their coach, I believe, And it's fun. What was Weaver their AD by the time that bowl
Yeah,
game had happened?
yeah.
That must have been really unique, and sort of a full circle moment for you because you're facing the team whose AD was the man who had hired you, and you had the curfew, and it was Dewberry, Gary Lee. What was the other receiver's name? Toby Pearson, and then there was Charles Mack. What happened with the curfew? I'm sure that was a tough decision to make, but at the end of the day, it was, right decision to make.
It wasn't a tough decision because they made the decision. I didn't.
Yes.
I told them what the parameters were, and I did have a weak moment. I went to the room and I said, "Carolyn, think of something. Get me out of this." And she said, "What did you say to the team?" And I said, "Well, I told them they would go home if they missed curfew." She said, "You don't have another option. Go tell them to go home." That's my tough wife.
Well, it shows.
It's just this life. You make mistakes and you pay for them, and there's a certain power and magic, especially in the sports arena. Regardless of your record, regardless of what the consequences are, when honor is upheld and you tell the truth, even though it cuts your guts out, to follow it changes lives.
And then Todd Rampley comes in and has the game of his career.
Yeah.
However, not what people don't talk about, and I feel enough, is Malcolm King had a stellar game in that bowl game.
So did John Ivanmeyer.
Yeah.
That's Malcolm running behind Ivanmeyer, that last drive. Boom, boom, boom.
And then the Black Watch defense had a great play to set up that game-winning drive where I think Swilling punched the ball out. I forget, I think his name was Ingram, I think was the running back's name, I believe.
No, Ingram.
No, he was the receiver.
Ingram was the All-American receiver.
Yeah, what was the name of the running back?
Lorenzo White,
White.
and Tony Mandarich.
Tony
were the
Mandarich.
three studs.
And punched it out, go down and score. And it was, not only did you have the whole curfew thing, but to win afterward, that must have been a great feeling.
Well, win or lose, the message was the same.
Yes.
But you can't, if you live in America and you get into a big game, any kind of big game, you damn sure better win it. Because if you don't, you're going to be remembered for one thing the rest of your life: you are a loser. That's just our culture. It's not right or wrong. It just is. So for that reason, I'm thrilled that we won. But whether we won or lost, the message would have been the same to our men, and I think they would have taken it that way.
And so 86 was a sort of a year. They went 5-5-1. However, one of the funniest moments in Tech history was the Tennessee game when you win because Tennessee's kicker slips on the artificial turf, and I think his name was Reviz.
Fuad Reviz.
And he was a great kicker.
A great kicker.
Great kicker. But wet patch on the turf or something, and he slips, and his kick still nearly made it in, and it hits the crossbar, and you held on and won. I'm curious because 85 was a good year, 9-2-1, most wins since 1970 and first bowl win since 72. Were you getting any calls for jobs after 85?
Oh yeah, I had no intention of going anywhere, and any kind of call I got, I just said thank you, no thank you, and there were some flattering moments, but and the Alabama call absolutely blew me away. And if it had not come from Ray Perkins, my old teammate, I think I would have hung up on him.
Yep.
But Perk said, "I want you to take this job." I said, "You got to be kidding!" He was going back to the NFL.
Yes.
And he said, well, do what you want to. If you want to be dumb and not take it, it's your business. And he was always very direct. But he was saying, I'm telling you, it's my school. I wish you would do it. I really wish you would come over here and do this. And then he said, and there was another guy that I admired greatly, Dr. Joab Thomas, really understood the athletics thing and the integrity thing. And Perk said, oh, by the way, Dr. Joab, this was on New Year's Eve.
New Year's Eve of '86, because you were,
It was 86.
yes, and
He said, Dr. Thomas is going to call you in 5 minutes. And he did. So that's how that happened.
and it's got, you know, like a lot of Tech fans, even with what happened with Ross, it hurt a lot of Tech fans. I wasn't around then, and say, like, if you get offered the Alabama job, that's even with Perkins and that, like, just if you're a football coach, you get offered the Alabama job, that does not come around often. So at the end of the day, I understand your decision. I mean, that's just an
I
opportunity.
understood the Tech people had put up with those terrible years and had been so patient and so wonderful. And then the way it looks is the first time I could get out the door, I took off. And I don't blame anybody who's angry about that or carries a grudge. I don't blame them at all.
So, okay, we're a little short on time, but what do you think of?
We got extra time. If you want to go ahead, I know you're going to do post-production, editing or whatever, so go ahead and
All right. So what do you? So I have a cut. So you go to Bama, you have good success there. Did they lowballed the contract at you, right? Was that?
No, they didn't do that. I mean, what they did was made it clear after 3 years that I was persona non grata. And the contract was changed in substantial ways, having to do with retention of assistants and who would decide who my assistants would be.
Which isn't right.
Well,
I mean, the head coach should decide it was me.
ever allow that. So those are the things that decision hinged upon. But it was a privilege every day to coach those Alabama players. They were wonderful. Could not have been more cooperative or could not have tried harder. We came very close to some great success, but not close enough. And that was my fault.
And what's funny is you laid the foundation for 2 national championship teams.
Well,
now, not directly, because
yeah.
it took Ross a little bit to get going, but still, with where Tech was when you started versus where you left, you did help lay a little bit of a starting point there. And then with Alabama, it was much more direct because your last recruiting class was on that Stallings team in '92.
I don't ever try to take credit for somebody else's accomplishments just because we were there earlier. What they did in the moment is how they won.
And then, what's funny, so one time, a couple years ago, I'm watching a rerun of the 1990 Tech Virginia game, and they started interviewing you, and your son was on that team, the Virginia team, right?
Yep. He was the long snapper.
He was the long snapper. That must have been what was that game like? One, the fact that you got to see it in person, that's one of the greatest ACC football games ever. But that must have been conflicting for you.
It was a nightmare. It was my flesh and blood on one side, and my alma mater, and of those players on the field that day, 18 of them were players that I had signed, and I loved them almost like sons, not quite, almost. But Billy Curry on the other side, that was a long, and we were there because Kentucky had an off day, and a friend offered to fly us over, and we weren't going to miss a chance to see our kid play. I had sworn my son would never hike a football, So naturally, he became the long snapper
Who literally hikes the football.
for the University of Virginia for 47 consecutive games.
Although, as I mentioned earlier, that Navy coach he beat you was the one he ended up playing for, which
George, yeah.
George, who was a brilliant coach, who thankfully he is in the Hall of Fame, because Virginia is a similar school to Tech, not only with academics but also in that basketball is kind of the
Yeah.
big thing for them. And so what George did at Virginia was remarkable.
George is a great football coach, great guy.
Another situation later on, which found you conflicted, was a couple months ago when Georgia State and Georgia Tech played each other. There's an article where you said you didn't want anyone to lose, but also it must have been a proud moment for you where the program you've started is playing your alma mater. What were your feelings about that game?
Well, I was surprised that the program had come this far, and I give credit to the coaches that took over, and we had to make a decision in our second year about changing levels of opposition at Georgia State, and we decided that we were competing in Atlanta, Georgia, and at the time we were playing in the Dome, and we were not going to pack that Dome. I mean, we got the feeling of what it was like to have 30,000 people in there, which was not quite packing it, but it was nice. We got that feeling in the first game we ever played, and good gosh, it was incredible, electric, and so we thought, if we're going to duplicate those crowds, we're going to have to play some big boys. So we did, and we got our nose bloody. But Georgia State fought on and started going to bowls, and in just a couple of years was pretty competitive, and that's been gratifying to see.
And then they beat Tennessee, which must have been really fun for you to watch.
I watched every snap.
That must have been. And I think you were the first season, they did play Alabama, right? You guys played at Alabama?
We played at Alabama the very first season. Our trainer at Georgia Tech was named Bill McDonald. He's an Alabama guy. So when we went to Alabama, he went with us to be the trainer. Then he was elevated from trainer to higher positions in the administration and got to be very close to Saban. He handled Saban's arrangements on trips and things. And he and I have stayed in touch all through the years. And he called me, and I don't think we had lined up 11 on 11. When he called me, he said, "Do y'all want to come over here and play?" I said, "Why don't you take 2 aspirin and go lie down somewhere? You think I'm insane? Come on, Bill." He said, "Okay, so you don't think that's a good idea?" I said, "No, it's insanity." He said, "Well, let me mention some numbers to you." So he mentioned some numbers, and my response was, "What days do y'all have open? We'll be over there anytime you want us." It was so much money, I had no choice.
Well,
So, and I was really interested to see how my guys responded when we went over. I thought they would be intimidated, and instead they were they had tears in their eyes. They were so excited, and they thanked me 1,000 times, even though we got crushed in the game, 62-3. 62-7, because Albert Wilson ran the kickoff back for a touchdown. It was another one of those moments where I just was glad for them that they got to go do that, even though we got wasted.
well, I mean, it's a huge stadium. It's expanded a lot since you were there, and just the aura of that venue.
It's Alabama.
Yes. And then I think you guys played Tennessee the second year.
Yeah, we did.
And so for you to go there, which you had been a couple times when you were at Tech and at Alabama, but then for you to watch them beat them, that 2019, so 5 years ago. That just must have been,
That was fun.
that was fun.
Yeah.
What do you think of the current administration with Brent Key? And a lot of people say Brent Key reminds them of O'Leary. If anybody, Brent Key reminds me of you, because he's an former offensive lineman. He has an Alabama connection. He came from Bama before Tech, and you went to Bama after Tech.
There's a big difference in Brent and the young Bill Curry. Huge difference. Brent had the privilege of working for O'Leary and Saban. He's been exposed. He has spent hundreds of hours in staff meetings, learning and adjusting and making decisions based on information that accumulates. And you watch geniuses do those things, proven winners. And you're in the room with them, and they're counting on you. And you have to come up with the schemes to block, and you got to get your O-linemen so that they can execute these incredible plans. Brent is 1,000 times better prepared than I was, and I am delighted that he's the coach, and I think he's the right guy.
I think, as a Tech fan, I'm not going to get too optimistic just so I'm, I don't want to get let down, but I think,
Don't.
yeah, but this season, I think, the schedule is a little easier, and I think if everyone stays healthy, I think it could be a successful
As
season.
long as our team doesn't make the same mistake you're making. You don't look at the schedule and say, "Oh, this one's easy."
Well,
yeah, wrong.
Well, I think Coach Key will keep that in check. But as a fan, you can. Although I will say, I was talking with someone earlier, and they said Temple, they got that guy from Sam Houston State who had a great success there. And so, as many people would have that as a gimme, it's like, don't overlook them. And then this whole, and I just realized he was the one who did it, the Curry Huddle thing, that, they're giving back to Tech. And
Pete did it, you're right.
And I think it's just fantastic. What do you think about that?
My heart just swells up. I get teary-eyed. I really get emotional because I know that most coaches that are given such significant honors of things like this have a much better record than I had. I know that. And I'm not sure at all why Pete and the rest of these guys do this. I'm just grateful that they do, and I love them. I've loved them already, and I love them more now in these years.
Oh, oh man, look at that. Curry Huddle hat. And it's black, which is the color that's most synonymous for your time at Tech.
I'll explain that if you want me to,
You
if
can-
we have time.
There's one more question I do want to ask, and I forgot to ask it earlier, but as an aspiring sports journalist, I don't know if you got to know him, but Al Seraldo was there when you were there.
Yes,
Do you have any stories about him, or him and Kim, and Kim yelling woo-hoo or what this and that? That you can
I
share.
got some stories that I can't tell.
Yeah.
Big Al.
But not about Al, but about some of the other characters that Kim was one of the best friends I ever had. I just broke my heart when we lost him, not because of Georgia Tech or football, but
Far too soon.
just a great human being. And our son, Billy Jr., is a lot smarter and a lot more talented than I am. He's really gifted at mimicking people. And when he was about 11 years old, he had Seraldo down cold, packed. And he would It's leather. It's a long,
Yeah,
high,
nice.
deep, short kick to the 25-yard line. I mean, just
You nailed it.
anything, any kind of little discrepancies. And Al had hundreds of them, of course, which is one of the things that endeared him to the listeners. But Billy could do him so well. That's one of my fondest Seraldo, many of my fondest Seraldo memories. And Billy's 54 years old, he can probably still do them.
So what does the UUU on the back mean?
When I was a rookie with the Packers, several things happened that were life-changing for me. You brought up one of them. It was my first time to be, I had been in huddles with African-American players in all-star games, Senior Bowl, Coaches All-America game, All-Star game. But I had never been on a real team where my teammates were of varied backgrounds, including African-American. I've spent my whole life on white football teams. And the night that Willie Davis took me aside, and I was shaking like a leaf because what I thought they would hear my Southern accent and injure me and send me home. And I didn't blame them. First of all, they were just the opposite. They were cordial. They were reasonably, they were respectful. They didn't take cheap shots on the field. And then one night, to my great shock, I was walking out of the dorm. It was August in West De Pere, Wisconsin, St. Norbert College. It's 42 degrees, and that ain't right. Not in August. And so I'm shaking anyhow, and this voice comes out of the darkness, Bill. I thought it was God. I just sat down in the grass or something. I was shaking. It was Willie Davis. And he said, I'd like to speak with you. And I thought, oh no, he's going to tell me to get lost. That's not what he did. He said, I've been watching you at practice, Bill, and I really like the way you work. You're trying so hard, and I think you've got a chance to make our team, and I'm going to help you. I know you're the last draft choice, and I know all that, but that doesn't matter. What matters is this. When I was a young player, we played in the world title game in Philadelphia against the Eagles. We got beat, and it's the only playoff game Lombardi ever lost. Willie said, I walked out off that field and I looked out there and there were popcorn boxes and newspapers blowing around. But that's not all that was on that field. There were regrets on that field. I had left regrets on the field because I did not give my very best, and I made up my mind. This will never happen to Willie Davis again. Bill, you come on that practice field tomorrow and the next day and the next, and you leave no regrets, and you'll make our team. And when you don't think you can take it another minute, and Ray Nitschke's tearing your head off, and he did, and Lombardi's screaming and spitting in your face and screaming profanity, and he did. When you don't think you can take it another minute, you come find me. I'll get you through it. I'll get you through it. Change my life. It was an unexpected, undeserved, unrewarded act of kindness. That's all it was, but that's all it took. A guy named Pete Welburn picked up on that.
So, well, that's kind of what y'all have done here with me. I'm an 18-year-old kid, and I'm here with you. This has really been a blessing for me, and I thank you for it. Tech fans, I think you all probably enjoyed this. Thank you for watching. Thank you to Pete and everyone who sang this up. And of course, thank you to Mr. Bill Curry, legend of the game of football.